Hi, my name's Fritz Klasner with BLM's National Landscape Conservation System, and I want to talk today about scientific opportunities on the National Landscape Conservation System, also known as BLM's National Conservation Lands. Today's talk is a coordinated effort with the U.S. Geological Survey Fort Collins Science Center, as well as BLM staff from across the country, particularly from Arizona, Nevada, California, and along with a few other colleagues across the country in BLM. The system is spelled out in legislation that Congress passed in 2009. And the purpose is to conserve, protect, and restore, CPR for shorthand, at least as a colleague of mine likes to say, um, and conserve, protect, and restore nationally significant landscapes that are designated by Congress or established through presidential proclamation. As of late January of this year in 2025, there were about 35 million acres and over 900 units within the system. Briefly want to go over each of these main types of units, and then we'll talk a little bit more about scientific opportunities. So first off, national monuments. There are 31 national monuments in the NLCS. Um, these are typically established by presidential proclamation under the authority of the Antiquities Act. Occasionally, they are established by Congress directly and through legislation. Example here of a national monument is Sand to Snow in California. Another second example are national conservation areas and similar designations. There are a variety of similar designations in the system, but all these other areas are established by Congress. STEES National Conservation Area is identified here. And the purpose of these areas really is up to Congress. It can be pretty wide ranging, and the designations are pretty wide ranging for why these areas are established. A third type of unit in the National Landscape Conservation System are wilderness study areas. There are almost 500 wilderness study areas in the BLM. The FLIPMA, or the Federal Land Management and Policy Act from 1976, directed the BLM to identify potential wilderness, and ultimately many of these areas were converted or created as wilderness study areas, and these remain as wilderness study areas until either released by Congress or designated as wilderness by Congress. So generally they're quite a stable designation type. A fourth type of unit is wilderness. There are, as the slide notes, 263 wilderness areas in the BLM at present. All our wilderness areas are established by Congress under the authority of the Wilderness Act. A fifth type of unit is National Scenic and Historic Trails. There are 19 scenic and historic trails in the system. Most of the trails, BLM manages only that portion that passes over lands held by the Bureau. However, the trails like Iditarod National Historic Trail in Alaska is administered by BLM, where BLM is the coordinating agency across all the land management jurisdictions where the trail crosses. And the final type of designation are wild and scenic rivers. There are 81 wild and scenic rivers in the system established by Congress, or in some circumstances designated by the Secretary of the Interior when requested by a governor of that state. So we identified four fundamentals for science in national conservation lands. The first is science informs and guides our management decisions. Science is one of many inputs into our decisions, not the only input into our decisions. Public input is an example of another very important input into our decisions. Second role for science in conservation lands is our science strategies. BLM is developing science strategies for national monuments and national conservation areas in particular, and these help us identify needs, anticipate, coordinate with partners, better strategize, take advantage of efficiencies, and so on. A third role for science in the national conservation lands is to promote these areas as sites for scientific research. The legislation that established the system, and often the designating language for individual units, talks about scientific values and scientific opportunities, and we want to implement the will of Congress and the president when we're administering the system. And finally, the BLM uses these areas as a laboratory for testing innovative land management practices, practices that can be applied elsewhere on BLM lands and elsewhere across the country. Science also is needed to support our decisions across public lands, and there are a number of laws that require this and that guide the use of science. National Environmental Policy Act, Endangered Species Act, Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act are just a few examples of that. Um, and of course, different bureaus have science strategies. The USGS has a landscape science strategy for 2020 to 2030. The BLM has an advancing science in the BLM strategic document, all of which help inform how we use science, how we apply science on public lands. Um, for the remainder of this talk, though, I want to focus on 7 science opportunities that we identify for national conservation lands. The first example are scientific values for which NLCS units were designated. There are a number of laws which talk about science, whether it's scientific objects of scientific interest, from the Antiquities Act, or scientific values from the Federal Land Policy and Management Act from 1976. Very rarely or occasionally maybe, individual designating language for a unit will specify what a scientific value is, as in this example of Craters in the Moon National Monument that's shown on this slide. But more broadly, we found no definition of scientific values in any of these documents, in any of these legislation histories. So we, for the purposes of this paper, developed a definition of scientific values, at least to operationalizing this paper, and that is objects, qualities, features, resources, processes, or species or places that have the potential to contribute information to the body of scientific knowledge that's not available elsewhere. Second example of a scientific opportunity within national conservation lands are those values that aren't called out in the designating language. Certainly, Congress or the presidential proclamations can't list every opportunity, every resource, or every feature or quality. There's a lot of things that we need to manage for, and science is important for all of those things, just as is important for those things that are specifically about the designating purpose. So we need to make sure that species are properly protected and managed. We need to protect water quality. We need to facilitate energy development, whatever the case may be. Science plans are one way of strategizing for this, providing priorities and helping guide our collaborative relationship with partners. A third type of opportunity are use of these areas as control sites. BLM is, of course, a multiple use and sustained yield agency. And we also have boundaries where these areas are designated. Sometimes the boundaries are related to features that are being studied. Sometimes the boundaries are not related. And those instances may create areas where situations where a control site can be established. Um, This is shown in the photo. It might be oil and gas. It might be energy transmission. It might be grazing. There's any number of ways where you can have a treatment and a control, and that type of application really strengthens the types of scientific conclusions that can be drawn. Fourth type of opportunity are those types of impacts that are common, where we really have a lot of management need and understand the often intense pressures that come with the activity. Recreation and livestock grazing are two of maybe the most common examples. As probably everyone is aware, recreation in popularity and intensity has increased in recent years, and so have the impacts. This is of increasing concern, as can be seen in this photo from the Red Rocks National Conservation Area outside of Las Vegas, but it's really a concern across the country, and it's not in any way limited to BLM and BLM's managed lands or the National Landscape Conservation System even. A fifth type of opportunity we want to talk about are the fact that these areas of conservation lands draw a high degree of interest and scrutiny from the scientists and the public. There are a variety of landscapes. They're often close to urban centers. Sometimes they're not, which has an equally valuable perspective. Many times they draw high numbers of visitors. This interest can bring a strong interest in land use planning. It can lead to citizen science opportunities to help have the public be interested in engaging and supporting with science. And this same level of interest can mean that these areas are hubs for collaborations with scientific partners. Oftentimes, this interest can extend and have benefits beyond just the National Conservation Land Units of interest. This example shown here with the Cotoni Coast Dairies south of the San Francisco Bay Area. There's obviously livestock grazing as seen in this photo within the unit, but there's quite a bit of public interest, quite a bit of academic interest with nearby universities. And so there's lots of ways of getting at all of these points that are listed on the slide. The sixth scientific opportunity you want to talk about is the network of the system as a whole, how the network is managed for similar purposes with some subtle differences across the types of units, subtle but important, and just the size. They're both linear features like rivers and trails across the landscape. There's over 38 million acres that are encompassed by the National Landscape Conservation System, over 900 units. And there are different questions that can be posed. And these questions can be posed in ways that get at both the value of scientific information within these areas, but also applicable more broadly across the landscape, whether that might be of interest to a forest service or national park service or state or privately held land that's not called out on this map. Seventh type of opportunity that I want to touch on is indigenous knowledge and the coordination and collaboration with tribal nations. Most of the National Conservation Lands units hold strong cultural significance. Many are considered sacred, or they have subsistence or ceremonial gathering. Tribal nations hold deep relationships, long histories of knowledge within these areas, and there are often questions of shared interest, interests that cross boundaries, interests that cross management jurisdictions, and uh, opportunities to participate and generate knowledge, address scientific questions that can be applied more broadly, all while honoring the connections and relationships that the Bureau has as part of our treaty and trust responsibility. Finally, just to think about how we can implement some of these opportunities, BLM has, as mentioned, science strategies. We've been working on these for a number of units, and we'll continue to work on them. We're hoping to release guidance as part of the underlying effort behind this paper, um, sort of additional resources for areas that have yet to prepare science strategies. We can, of course, conduct science carefully to protect the resources. We can promote the value of science and decision making, really make sure that the scientific research that has been done, the scientific knowledge that's available is available to decision makers. We can participate in scientific partnerships to advance management. We can work with the public, such as with citizen science, but in other opportunities. And we can, of course, share the scientific findings that are available, regardless of who actually collected the science. We want to make sure that science on public lands is shared with the public whenever it's appropriate and possible. And with that, I want to say thank you. My contact information is listed here along with one of my co-authors, Sarah Carter, with the U.S. Geological Survey Fort Collins Science Center. Thank you again, and I'm happy to take any questions.